Have you ever witnessed a moment so raw, so painful, that it seared itself into your soul forever? Picture this, a funeral, heavy with sorrow, where silence pressed against every heart. A mother laid to rest, a coffin lowered into the cold earth. And then above the pastor's trembling prayers rose the piercing cries of a baby, tiny, helpless. Her wails echoed through the church, begging for comfort, but no one moved. Not a single hand reached for her. One by one, people turned their faces away, ashamed, afraid, unwilling to carry the weight of her grief. But then, footsteps. From the shadows at the back, a figure emerged. Tall, silent, eyes unreadable. A man the town had always feared, distrusted, and whispered about an Apache. The crowd stiffened, their breath caught. Surely he would not. Surely he could not. Yet, in that moment, when every soul stood frozen, he did what no one else dared. He stepped forward. What happened next silenced the entire town, shattered prejudice, and carried a truth so powerful it would be remembered for generations. Because sometimes, it takes the quietest soul to do the loudest thing. The church bells tolled low and heavy, echoing across the valley like a mourning heart that could not stop trembling. A funeral had gathered nearly the whole town, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats, shawls pulled close against the cold breeze that carried sorrow like smoke. People stood in hushed silence, shifting feet on the wooden floorboards, glancing at each other, at the coffin up front, at the family left behind. Yet among the tears and the whispers, one sound pierced through it all. Sharp and unbearable, the desperate wails of a baby. The child's cries rose above the pastor's voice, drowning the prayers, rattling the hearts of those who tried to keep their eyes forward. The baby was small, bundled in a thin blanket, cheeks red from cold and grief alike. She cried as if her tiny lungs were carrying the sorrow of her mother and father, gone too soon, lowered now into the earth. But the townsfolk, they pulled away. No one reached to lift her. No one dared to hold her. Some shifted uncomfortably, muttering excuses, "Not my place. Don't know what to do." Others turned their heads, unwilling to carry the weight of another's burden. A few even frowned, whispering sharp judgments about the child's family, about the misfortune that followed them like a curse. The pastor hesitated, his words faltering as the cries grew louder, breaking the rhythm of the service. He cleared his throat, tried again, but the sound was relentless. That tiny life was begging, pleading for someone to come closer. Yet all hands stayed folded, all arms stayed empty. The baby's sobs turned to choking gasps, and she kicked beneath her blanket, desperate for comfort that no one would give. The air grew tense, shame hanging heavy in the silence between her cries. Mothers clutched their own children closer. Fathers looked at the ground. It was easier to pretend not to hear, easier to stand still and wait for it to end. And then, movement. At the very back of the room where shadows clung to the wooden walls, a man slowly stepped forward. His presence had gone unnoticed until now, for he was quiet, standing apart from the rest. Tall, broad-shouldered, his long black hair tied loosely behind him, his face carved by years of wind and sun. He wore buckskin faded from use, moccasins worn thin, and in his dark, unreadable eyes was something that made people straighten where they stood. He was Apache. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Some shifted aside as he passed, casting wary glances, murmuring under their breath. Old wounds, old fears, old stories of raids and bloodshed haunted their thoughts, though none of them truly knew this man. To them, he was only the Indian, the outsider who lived quietly beyond town, rarely speaking, rarely seen. Yet here he was stepping forward, when none of them would. The baby's cries faltered as his shadow fell across her, as if even she could sense something different in his presence. The Apache man knelt slowly, careful not to startle her, and extended a calloused hand. For a long breath, the townsfolk watched in silence, expecting her to cry harder, to recoil from his touch. But instead, the baby reached her tiny fingers, clutched at his hand, holding on as if she had finally found what she had been searching for. And in that instant, her cries softened, fading into trembling whimpers before settling into silence. The room froze. The pastor's words died on his tongue. Mothers who moments ago would not move, leaned forward in disbelief. Fathers who had looked away now could not tear their eyes from the scene before them. A hush swept through the funeral as if time itself had stopped to witness what no one could explain. The Apache lifted the child with a gentleness that did not match his weathered frame. He held her against his chest, steady and sure, rocking her with a rhythm that seemed older than the town itself, older than the church, older than the divisions carved between their peoples. The baby's small body relaxed, her breathing slowed, and within moments she drifted into quiet sleep, her face pressed against the heartbeat that promised she was no longer alone. A woman in the crowd gasped softly, hand to her lips. Another blinked back sudden tears. For all their hesitation, for all their fear, none of them could deny what they saw. A bond forming before their very eyes, one that defied reason, one that silenced judgment. But even in that stillness, whispers began to stir. "Why him?" someone muttered. "She shouldn't be in his arms. He doesn't belong here." Their words were laced with prejudice, with suspicion, yet they dared not step forward to take the child themselves. Their own hesitation betrayed them. They had abandoned her when she needed them most, and only the man they distrusted had given her what she cried for. The Apache ignored their murmurs. His gaze remained fixed on the child, steady and unyielding, as though no voice could shake his decision. In his silence, in his stillness, there was a strength that unsettled the room more than anger ever could. He had stepped into their space, into their sorrow, and without asking, he had taken upon himself what none of them dared. The pastor cleared his throat, stumbling to continue the sermon, though his voice trembled now. The coffin was lowered, prayers resumed. But the eyes of the people kept drifting again and again toward the man holding the child, because deep down, they all knew something had shifted. The child who had been left untouched, abandoned in her grief, was no longer alone. The silent Apache had crossed an invisible line, one that no one else dared approach. And though many would not admit it, a question gnawed at their hearts. Why had he done it? The answer, though unspoken, lingered in the air like a secret yet to be revealed. And as the last clods of earth thudded on the coffin lid, as the crowd began to scatter, eyes still watching him, one truth remained clear. The moment was not the end, it was the beginning of something that would shake them all. The baby had stopped crying, but the silence that followed carried more weight than her wails ever had. When the last handfuls of earth were pressed into place and the townsfolk began to drift away, whispers trailed behind them like smoke. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others muttered warnings to one another, but not a single one dared step forward to reclaim the child. They had left her crying at her mother's funeral, and it was the silent Apache, an outsider in their eyes, who now carried her as if she were his own. He stood tall, cradling her gently, and for the first time in years, his gaze swept across the people who had always turned their backs on him. Not a word left his lips, yet the silence in his eyes struck harder than any voice. Without another glance, he turned and walked away, the child secure in his arms, her tiny fingers still clutching his shirt as if she refused to let him go. That night, stories traveled faster than the wind. By lantern light in kitchens, in hushed tones around fires, families whispered, "He took her home." Some swore it was an omen, others claimed it was dangerous. "An Apache raising one of ours. It won't end well." Fear spread through the town like wildfire, but beneath it all, there was another truth. No one dared to speak aloud that not one of them had lifted a hand when the baby needed comfort. Days turned to weeks. The baby grew quieter, her cries now softened by the warmth of a steady arm. Her hunger met, her loneliness eased. The Apache, whose name few in town even knew, tended to her with patience that seemed impossible to those who watched from afar. He rocked her by the fire each night, carried her close when he worked, and when she reached for him, he answered without hesitation. The people noticed. Some evenings, women fetching water from the well caught sight of him carrying the child, her small head tucked under his chin. They paused, unable to turn away, their hearts pulling in directions their minds resisted. For every whisper of suspicion, another whisper of wonder grew. Why would he care for her like that? Why not leave her as we did? Still, the fear of difference ran deep. Men muttered that it wasn't right. Elders said it would bring misfortune. And though no one dared take the child back, resentment simmered just beneath the surface. Then one night, as a storm ripped across the valley, lightning flashing against the dark sky, the truth of what the silent Apache carried inside him began to unravel. Inside his small cabin, he sat by the fire, the child bundled safely against his chest. His hand brushed across her hair, and for the first time in years, his voice broke the silence. Low, rough, but trembling with weight, he whispered words meant only for her. You will not be left as mine was." The flames flickered against his face, revealing the shadows of memories buried deep. He saw again the distant smoke of his village, the riders who had come with fire and gun, the cries of women and children scattered into the hills. He saw the face of his own daughter, dark hair like her mother, eyes that once lit his world, taken from his arms before he could save her. He had searched, begged the winds for her name, but she was gone. Since that day, silence had been his companion. Since that day, his heart had been a grave he dared not open. But now, in the small, fragile cries of this orphaned baby, he had heard her echo, and when no one else would touch her, his soul had recognized her as his second chance, not to erase the past, but to honor it. The storm raged outside, but inside, a vow was forged. He would raise this child, protect her, give her the life denied to his own. No matter the whispers, no matter the hatred, he would not let her go. Morning came, and with it, changed the baby. Once frail and restless, began to smile. Her laughter, small and trembling, rang out in the valley like a bird's first song after winter. It caught the ears of those who passed his cabin. Children, curious, peeked through the trees, watching her tiny hands reach for the beads he carved to amuse her. Even mothers who once turned away now found themselves pausing, eyes softening, as they saw the child thrive where they thought she would fade. The townsfolk's suspicion began to falter. Some still muttered, but others carried questions in their hearts they could not silence. Could it be that the very man they feared had shown more humanity than any of them? Could it be that what they had witnessed at the funeral was not a moment of chance, but a truth meant to shame them all? The pastor himself came one evening, hesitant, hat in hand. He stood at the doorway, unsure of his welcome, but the Apache only stepped aside, wordlessly allowing him in. Inside, the pastor saw what no sermon could deny: the baby sleeping peacefully, wrapped in warmth, her face free of tears. The pastor lowered his head, and with a voice quieter than prayer, he said, "Perhaps the Lord chooses whom he wills." Word spread again, but this time differently. Respect began to creep into the same voices that once condemned. Slowly, the baby was no longer spoken of as cursed, but blessed. And though many could not understand, they began to see the Silent Apache not as a threat, but as a guardian chosen by something greater than their prejudice. Months passed. The baby grew stronger, her laughter filling spaces once silent. Where once no one would touch her, now children played near her. Women offered milk and cloth. Men nodded silently when they passed, and always, at the center of it all, stood the Apache, never asking, never boasting, simply carrying the vow he had made. But the memory of that day at the funeral never left them. The moment he had stepped forward, when none of them did, moment he had silenced her cries with nothing but the strength of his arms remained burned into their hearts. It was not just the child who had been saved that day. It was them too, for in his silence, in his strength, in the love he gave when no one else would, he had forced them to see themselves, and it took their breath away, because what the Silent Apache did was not simply lift a child. He had lifted the weight of their shame, broken the chains of their fear, and shown them what true humanity looked like. The crying baby had been left all alone, but because of him, she would never be alone again. And the town, it would never forget the day the Silent Apache stepped forward. Seasons turned. The child who had once been left crying in the cold shadows of grief grew into a girl whose laughter was as steady as the sunrise. Where once no one reached to touch her, now she was the heart of the town. She toddled through the dusty streets, her small hand always in the Apache's, her voice calling him with the only name she had ever known, Father. The people who once whispered now watched her with softened eyes. They saw how she flourished in his care, how every step she took carried the quiet strength he had given her. And though prejudice did not vanish overnight, something deeper had taken root. Respect. The memory of that day at the funeral lingered, haunting them, reminding them of the truth. They had turned away, and he had stepped forward. But the Apache never sought their praise. He asked for nothing. He lived simply, worked with steady hands, and gave the child everything he had once lost. To him, she was not a symbol, not a debt to be repaid. She was life reborn, a promise kept, the second chance the Great Spirit had laid upon his path. Years passed, and the bond between them grew, unbreakable. She became his shadow, his laughter, his reason to rise with each dawn. And though she did not carry his blood, she carried his heart. Wherever they went, the town could not help but see it. the strength of a man who had lost everything but still chose love when hate would have been easier. And then, one evening as the sun bled gold across the horizon, the girl, now older, her hair long and bright, stood before the townsfolk gathered for a harvest gathering. She held her father's hand tightly, her voice clear as she spoke words that silenced the crowd. "I was left alone once. I was crying, and no one came, no one but him. And I will never forget." The Apache did not move, but in his stillness, the weight of her words struck like thunder. Mothers wept openly, fathers bowed their heads, elders felt shame wash over them once more, for it was the truth they had tried to bury, but could never escape. What the Silent Apache had done that day was more than comfort a child. He had carried her into life when no one else dared. He had given her a future when the world turned away. And in doing so, he had carved a place in history, not with weapons, not with power, but with a single act of love, so pure it had broken every wall between them. The girl leaned against him, her eyes glistening. "He is my father, and I am who I am because he stepped forward when no one else would." Silence fell heavy across the crowd. Breath caught in throats, hearts throbbed with unspoken guilt and awe. For in that moment, they finally saw him not as an outsider, not as a shadow, but as the very soul who had taught them what it meant to be human. The Apache looked out over them, his face lined with years, his eyes steady and calm. He did not speak, for he never needed words. The truth was already carved into their hearts. The child once abandoned at a funeral had become the living testimony of his love, and the town would never again forget the day when everyone turned away and the Silent Apache stepped forward. If you felt the story in your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel to join our journey and never miss a story that touches the soul. Follow us for more tales that stir your heart and leave you speechless. Thank you for watching, and remember, every act of kindness, no matter how small, can change a life forever.